Hello, my relearn friends. My name's Peter Hutton. I'm the director and co-founder of the Future Schools Alliance. The Future Schools Alliance is a global collaboration of innovators who are aligning to transform learning communities and to co-evolve the future of education together. I wish we were meeting in person today, but we'll have to go with the virtual method. And at the end of this 15 minutes, I'd love to spend some time answering any questions, just exploring how we can transform education together. Prior to starting with the Future Schools Alliance, I was actually the principal of a school in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia, called Templestowe College. It had basically been a school of over 1,000 that hadn't done anything wrong, but just hadn't moved with the times. And what it had seen was the number of students drop down to 286 local students. We had some international students as well, and just 23 year sevens. So it had gone from this rather large school down to this tiny school. And you'll see a picture of the phoenix there. Ironically, that was the school the symbol of the school magazine, and certainly we were crashing to the ground, and the hope was that like the phoenix, we would burst into flame and then something beautiful would come from that. So the session that I'd like to talk to you about today is in fact called Creating Empowered and Self-Authoring Learning Communities. And indeed, that was what we attempted to do at my time, my 8 years as principal at Templestowe College in Melbourne, Victoria. It was a very interesting time for the school. We had a unique marketing policy. This was the sign that greeted me when I started at TC. This was on the front door of the school, and indeed it was working because we had very few students coming to the school. But that was sort of symptomatic of the philosophy that we had, that students were in some ways second-class citizens and had to use, the trades entrance, if you will, around the side of the school. And so that was one of many signs that I removed as I started my role there. We started with a very simple premise, and that is that yes is the default. And essentially, it goes like this, that any student, staff, or parent who had a suggestion on how they would like to change the school, the answer had to be yes, unless indeed it took too much time, too much money, or negatively impacted on somebody else. So it could take as much of the students' time. If they wanted to invest their own time, then that was fine, or indeed their own or their parents' money, that was fine as well. It just couldn't take too much of the school's time in terms of staff resource, etc., and couldn't take too much of our money. It could certainly take some. And of course, it couldn't negatively impact on somebody else. And this was basically the rule that enabled us to develop this co-ownership, if you will, of a government school located in Melbourne, Victoria. We also started with the idea of what would happen if we allowed students to be able to study whatever they wanted. And after some discussion, because it was very difficult for students to break out of this concept of, subjects, and unless they'd heard about somebody else studying a similar subject at another school, they hadn't really considered it. But we got to the point where students identified that they would, certainly some students and a significant number, would like to study working with animals. Some others came up with the idea of computer gaming design, and they went down and pursued that track. But with the working with animals, I think it's a good example. We literally started by the teacher of that subject, who happened to be a biology teacher, driving to a fairly out there pet store and coming back with a snake and some chickens and some fish and some insects. I might point out that the chickens and the snake weren't in the same cage. But it literally started from very humble beginnings, and over the course of 8 years grew into something that actually resembled a small zoo, and required an enormous amount of permissions and licenses to run. We had countless snakes and reptiles. We had a bird breeding program. We had an aquaponics program. We had goats and alpacas and sheep. We had 16 acres in the centre of Templestowe, which is, it's in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne. No doubt the department were hoping that perhaps the school would close because they could get a pretty penny for the site. And I guess what I would encourage you to do as we spend some time before taking questions is to start questioning some of the assumptions that you have about schooling. So one of the key ones is that all students learn at the same rate. And obviously I've got the picture of the battery hen farm there, because I think often schools really are a production line model. And some of the things in the course of 8 years that we did was remove reference to year levels, remove that assumption of a 13-year progression from what we would call prep all the way through to year 12. So to the point where some students could spend 6 years of their secondary education. Other students could shorten that down to 5, in some cases even 4. And on the odd occasion, a student that just needed that extra year could in fact stay for 7 years or even 8. One of the interesting things was, as soon as we removed year levels, the incidence of bullying almost disappeared, which was a remarkable thing. It wasn't something that we were anticipating. And when we actually asked the students what's going on, they actually said that it's like every person now has a big brother or sister, and if anyone's hassling them, there's always somebody to go to help sort things out. One of the other assumptions in schools is that they're all about hierarchy and so on. And one of the things that we introduced was something called a one-person policy, and that meant that it didn't matter if you were 13 or 30. Didn't matter if you were the principal, an entry student who was just 12 years old starting off at the school, or a graduate student, or anywhere in between. Everyone was considered to be of equal worth and needed to be treated with an equal amount of respect. And it wasn't a case of student or staff lowering themselves to the level of the students. It was indeed that the students were expected to lift their behaviour to the level of the staff, and what we called an aspirational adult standard. We also tried to assume unconditional positive regard for students, and that if we saw behaviour that in most schools would be considered warranting of some sort of disciplinary consequence, we would assume that there was some form of plan that the student had that just wasn't being properly executed, hadn't been thought out. So in the end, we had no detentions. We had in a school of what grew to 1,000 students, or in fact 1,100 students, no detention. Now, we did have lots of long and engaged conversations, but no detentions in a school of that size. We also assume that students have no right to say who works with them, and we thought that was amazingly unfair. And so we actually would show the students who was going to be teaching them in their various electives. And if they felt that they couldn't get along with that person, or for whatever reason didn't have a good relationship with that staff member, or indeed some of the other members of the class, they were free to actually move. Now, in the end, we had over 170 electives, because we were always going back to that key question, what would you like to learn? We had 170 electives, and every student had their own individualised learning plan. And some people would think that that was impossible to achieve. It's a government school that didn't receive a single dollar of any extra funding for any reason. But we actually came up with a model of individualised learning plans that the students wrote themselves. And each of those plans had a 5-year time horizon, looking forward 5 years, which sort of tended to stop students from just selecting subjects that were just fun, but instead they had a 5-year plan of where their studies were going to take them. They were written by students. Their parents signed off that they were agreeable with that plan, and then it was viewed by a member of the senior leadership team, just to make sure that it had some degree of logic. And look, most of the time I have to say that students' choices were in fact in some cases more conservative than the staff. We talked at the start and in the heading about self-authoring and empowered, co-owned schooling environments. There's an assumption often that students, are there at the school to take from the school, but we don't often think about what students can contribute, indeed, to the running of the school. And we came up with a rule in the end that we wouldn't employ an adult to do a job around the school, that we thought that a student had a realistic chance of completing with a degree of support. And so one of the key performance indicators of the assistant principal was indeed that we would end up employing 10% of the student population to help run the school. And these were some of the jobs that they did. Students were paid for these jobs. Indeed, some of the students could take one of the 6 subjects that they would normally be allocated to. They could in fact take 1 or 2 lines of work. So they could actually be employed as perhaps a tutor in the maths faculty, or they could be running their own business, perhaps running a coffee cart, etc. So we really did blur the distinction between what was learning and what was work or entrepreneurship and running your own business, etc. We had 80 businesses from ideation, just sort of coming up with the ideas, all the way through to fully functional operating businesses. We ran a thing called Kids Tank, which was a little like the concept of Shark Tank, where students would pitch their ideas to members of the leadership team, some students, and also a local entrepreneur. And we had 10 $2,500 business startup grants. These are just some of the student-run businesses that we had there. And no doubt if you're interested, you could just pause the video and have a look at those. We're very familiar with the concept of STEAM. We would call it STEAM. So science, technology, engineering, arts and mathematics. But we would always try and put an entrepreneurial lens over each one of those subjects. So post-TC, I in fact had a conversation with Professor Yong Zhao, who had travelled the journey for at least 6 of those 8 years with me at TC, and he challenged me, 1 school is great, Peter, but 50 schools is better. And indeed, that was the motivation that I needed to leave my favourite job, which was Principal of Templestowe College, and start, along with David Runge, something called the Future Schools Alliance. And since leaving TC, we've come up with something called the Momentum Series, which is a school adaptive cultures framework, which helps schools that are wanting to innovate to move along the transformational journey. And it starts by looking at strategy, then moves into a deep analysis of the culture that's operating within the school, and finally the innovation. And so with that, I'd like to conclude the session today. I would love to take your questions. That was really only a snapshot of some of the things that we did at Templestowe College over the years, and indeed some of the innovations that we're now starting to see take hold in the Future Schools Alliance schools. We have 65 schools in Australia and New Zealand, and we've got a number of international school partners as well. And if school transformation is something that you're interested in, and why wouldn't you be? You're on Relearn looking for these sorts of ideas, I'd love you to reach out and get in touch with us. So with that, let's take some questions. And if indeed you'd like to get in touch with us, here are my details.